Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the PRI conference. Wonderful to see everybody in the room so early this morning. The coffee must be good. My name is James Lewry, and it's my privilege to moderate this panel on human rights due diligence. There's a lot to cover this morning. I've got a fantastic panel, which I'll introduce shortly to you. And I'm sure you'll all have questions about what is probably one of the most misunderstood areas, perhaps, of ESG. So we have lots to talk about this morning. So we're here because we and the businesses that we invest in have a responsibility to respect human rights in those businesses. We talk about human rights, but it's important to understand that we're talking here about the basic civil, political, and economic freedoms, as well as labor rights of the workforce that power these businesses, and also the communities that are impacted by those businesses as well. And of course, the UN Guiding Principles back in 2011 made this responsibility very clear, particularly for investors. And as we've seen over the last 12 years, this soft, non-binding law has become hard law through the various international acts and legislation that we're continuing to see. So things like the LKSG in Germany, the Norwegian Supply Chain Act, and here as well, we've had the laws last year in Japan, but also most recently in Korea, where we've seen a bill being proposed now for mandatory due diligence in supply chains. And of course, most eyes, I think, are on the European legislation, so the CSRD, and of course, the Corporate Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive, which is coming in thick and fast soon, and has been updated with guidance for investors as well. So there's a lot of regulation coming, there's a lot of laws out there, but so too are the challenges. So for investors of all different types, there are many different challenges to due diligence in the supply chain, and we'll touch on some of those this morning. And those challenges, of course, include for private markets, things like complex ownership structures, things like the lack of external pressure, and so on. For institutional investors, the size and the diversity of portfolios can be very challenging for due diligence and make it tricky to identify those risks that emerge. And of course, we heard yesterday how not taking a rights holder lens and stakeholder engagement in due diligence means that often that due diligence is ineffective. So there are a lot of challenges, and I think I saw a case study recently which brought to life a few of these, which was in the case of some institutional investors where a complaint was raised by 4 trade unions into these institutional investors that had invested in McDonald's Corporation, where issues of gender-based violence and harassment hadn't been picked up in that due diligence. And so the complaint was raised and upheld. But the unions also accepted that even though these institutional investors had actually quite advanced due diligence programs, the failure to pick this up was because they hadn't taken a gender-based lens to their due diligence. So extremely important lessons there. So really the question we're going to be posing this morning is what can investors do, so what can we all do to strengthen that due diligence in our activities? And to help me with that, I've got a fantastic panel this morning, and I'll introduce you to them. So firstly, Suzanne, who's a partner and head of responsible investment at StepStone Group. StepStone is an investment firm that invests and advises in over 600 billion of assets across private markets globally. Suzanne leads the ESG integration and impact investment efforts across the firm's asset classes of private equity and venture capital, infrastructure, real assets, real estate, and private debt. So a lot on Suzanne's plate. Next up is Kawai-san. She's a senior ESG specialist at Nomura Asset Management, and she's also part of the signatory advisory committee for the PRI's Advanced Initiative. Next, from a company perspective, we're very fortunate to have Tanimura-san, who is the Director, EVP and CHRO of Asahi Group Holdings. Tanimura-san has served the group for an impressive 34 years. And since joining Asahi Breweries in 1989, he's got a very deep understanding, of course, of the company history, which no doubt will come across this morning. And he's now responsible for overseeing human rights and sustainability initiatives across the group. And then finally, to give a global perspective on due diligence trends is Áine Clarke. So Áine is the head of KnowTheChain, an investor strategy at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So Áine will be sharing some practical insights from the recent 2023 food and beverages benchmark to give us that global perspective. So a bit of a food and beverage sector focus on the panel, but no doubt the lessons that you'll be learning this morning and the discussion will be applicable across sectors. So we'll no doubt get to those shortly. We have got a format this morning which is slightly different perhaps to some of the panels that you saw yesterday. So each of our speakers will give a 5-minute intervention from their perspective on due diligence. We'll have a short panel discussion, and then it's really about you and your questions. So I'm sure there'll be many in the room this morning. So I do want to give you an opportunity to ask those. So without further ado, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here first thing in the morning. So, as you heard, my context is private markets. And when we look at our engagement with our investment managers or general partners, as they're termed in private markets, when we look at the on-ramps that those groups have into addressing human rights, there's 2 key on-ramps that are evident. The first is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the second one is operational health and safety. So when we think about sort of the on-ramp around the DE&I effort, and this has been, I would just note as an aside, very strongly driven in the US by the LP base in the US. And so when we look at actually ESG practices for US managers, it is probably disproportionately developed and focused on DE&I as a result of that. That's not to say that we don't see a DE&I effort elsewhere in the world, but it has a slightly different nuance. So we have the on-ramp where GPs are focusing on diversity efforts in their own operations. And then once that sort of filters down, there's a diversity effort that feeds into the portfolio companies, where GPs inevitably start to track data, particularly at the board level, and then moving to executive management. What's quite helpful that we're seeing develop now is quite a lot of research that is coming out to hopefully inform where the best leverage comes. So obviously board diversity we know is extremely important. Newer research is showing just how important and effective executive management diversity actually is. So I think we'll continue to see those practices mature. The second on-ramp, as I said, operational health and safety. This is done generally very well by managers who have a sector specialization in those areas where operational health and safety is a common problem. So their language, their toolkit tends to be very advanced. A lot of the industrials businesses in the food space, but interestingly, of course, COVID showed that there was a broader interpretation of operational health and safety, and perhaps an outcome of that terrible experience for us all collectively was a broadening awareness of the applicability of OH&S. Those 2 focuses probably have sucked quite a lot of capacity from GPs before moving on to the big and broad issue of addressing human rights in supply chains and addressing supply chains. So when we think about human rights, I think there is still a nascent understanding that it is a much broader umbrella than just DE&I or OH&S, that there's a myriad of issues that sits under this. And when we look at the movement into the supply chain, what we see is I will give you an example. So, in the food manufacturing and production space, what we saw quite recently was a spate of issues of child labor in US food manufacturing and production plants. Now, this was really important because I think there'd been some broad perception that it only happens in emerging markets. I think there had also been a perception that it might not happen for some of the most developed and well-respected investment managers across the space. And, some of the learnings from this were, I think, quite important as well. It showed that even with the most sophisticated, and they were in place, some of the most sophisticated paper, visa, work registration, paper checking methodologies, they were bypassed. It is easy to bypass them. Not easy, but it is possible to bypass them. Second, what it showed was particularly in communities, a lot of immigrant communities that were sorely affected because of COVID, the entire community actually became complicit. So you had members of the community who were in plants. When an opportunity came up, they were only too happy to get it to a community member, even knowing that that community member was underage. That's quite sophisticated to address, right? Changing the incentive patterns within people working within organizations to accept that there is going to be a code of behavior. That takes quite a lot of work, right? Understanding that then solving that problem required, that business, that investment manager to engage more broadly with that community, often a new immigrant community, language issues, trying to access support functions, dealing with, NGOs, a variety of stakeholders in the community to help that community, to build skills in the community, make sure they're accessing what could be accessed. Can't live in the bubble of the asset anymore. So I think, you can, that example for me does stick with me because we had a lot of our clients going, well, how come they didn't walk through the plant and identify that there were children there? And that just shows that it is really difficult to identify what was going on, but the solutions were even more complex.
Yeah, it's so true, Suzanne. Thank you. And I think speaking to delegates yesterday at the conference, this issue of child labour, and particularly where it's linked to climate change as well, has been something coming out quite strongly in the themes that we've seen. But some really important points there. Thank you. Let's look at public markets next. And over to you, Kawai-san.
Yes. So for Nomura Asset Management as well, the governance of human rights is one of the most important ESG issues. And so we try to accurately understand the human rights initiatives of portfolio companies. And we are increasing the number of dialogues related to human rights risk management so that companies can appropriately manage those risks. So I introduce our human rights risk monitoring process with this slide. So there are 3 key steps. One is risk monitoring, so which company, which sectors have a higher risk of human rights risks, because we invest in so many companies in a lot of sectors. So we are screening those high risk companies. And second is engagement with those high risk companies. And lastly, we integrate those engagement results to our investment decision. And as to risk monitoring, this first step, we focus on sectors with complex supply chain and sectors that produce products with high human rights risks in production areas and raw material procurement areas. And those are the 5 sectors I categorized: automobiles, ITC, food and agriculture, apparel, and resource-related sectors. And so we engage with companies that have been determined to have high human rights risks through risk monitoring. And we do this risk monitoring with 6 perspectives. So one is whether the company has a human rights related policy, because policy is very important. And the second is whether the company is conducting human rights due diligence. And how this human rights diligence is how robust we are also checking. For example, they are doing the survey of their suppliers, and or they are disclosing those survey results, and whether they are doing on-site audits of suppliers, and they have established whether they have established access to grievance mechanism. So these are the 6 perspectives to check whether this company has a high human rights risk or not. And those companies, and together with the companies where already human rights related allegation or some incidents happen, together we engage with those companies and integrate the results to our investment portfolio. And so one case study of those engagement is engagement with one Japanese big apparel company. So several years ago, there was a allegation that their cotton supply chain is related to human rights risks, forced labor. So we started engagement around 2 years ago, and the company has replied that their garment, their primary garment factory, and also secondary textile factory level, they have all checked and confirmed, and there have been no environmental or human rights risks. But at the same time, they have been in these 2 years, they have been strengthen their risk management system further. And nowadays, they have almost completed a risk management system for cotton supply chains. That means that not only monitor their garment factory and their upstream material factories, they go further up to their spinning mills. And if possible, as possible, they do maximum effort to go up to the cotton supply chain, etc. So this is an example of the successful engagement. The higher transparency of their traceability, and then this solid system of their risk management. So they are improving year by year. So so this is an example, and we would like to. So there is a lot of levels depending on the companies. This is a very good example, but a lot of the companies still at the beginning stage. So we would like to communicate with many portfolio companies to introduce this kind of best practice to some lagging companies. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Kawai-san. And I think a nice example there of how you apply risk management principles across what sounds like a complex portfolio of companies. So thank you for that. Speaking of companies, we are lucky to have Asahi Group here. And so I'll pass to Tanimura-san to give us a perspective of how companies are responding to the due diligence challenges.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everyone. Let me start by explaining what we have been doing on human rights so far. So we developed our group human rights principle in 2019. So at that time, we have identified 3 focus areas, which are our employees, our supply chain, and access to remedies. In terms of employees, the key topics is responsible employment. We conducted a local field survey in Japan on employment of technical intern from Vietnam, as well as migrant labor at Malaysian business in the group. In terms of the supply chain, we look at both of the supplier risk and raw material risk. For the supplier risk, we started with the very, very basic ones, including a CSR survey of all first-tier suppliers. And also, we conducted the individual assessment of those with high risk and asking for corrective actions if needed. That's a very basic one. And for the new material risk, we conducted human rights impact assessment and stakeholders interviews for the coffee beans plantations in Ethiopia and Tanzania in 2021, and also for sugarcane plantations in Brazil in 2022. So looking back on our effort from 2019, to be honest, there are many things to be improved still. And also, there are still gap between what we had been doing and what we can do. So we found knowledge and resource to promote the human rights agendas were not enough, to be honest. That's the core of our looking back from the past activities. So this year, we started from redefining the positioning of human rights in our company. In the past, we had people as one of the 5 material issues, and human rights was just a part of it. So we have decided to replace the people with human rights. Also, we introduced human rights not as just one of the 5 material issues, but also clearly indicated human rights is the foundation of all business activities. So to meet this ambition, we are now revising the Asahi Group Code of Conduct, Human Rights Principles, Supplier Code of Conduct, and as well as establishing the grievance mechanism, who are all essential for our improvement for the future. Then we are rebuilding the strategies for human rights agendas. And also, we have been developing the targets for 2030 and its roadmap to implement strategies. We had the strategy from the, we had strategies from 2019, and we were trying effort, but we realized we need continuously revise our strategy along with the circumstance change. So we rebuilt strategy with the clearer target and roadmap. So finally, as a CHRO, I'd like to insist on the importance of people and corporate culture to accelerate human rights agendas, because I believe only people can implement the strategies. Also, people and employees are one of the very important stakeholders to be associated with the human rights. And also corporate culture is very important, because if we have a wrong corporate culture might disrupt our way to implement the human rights respecting. So, as a CHRO, I'd like to insist on the importance of people and corporate culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanimura-san. And I think a really important message there at the end about corporate culture, and certainly reflected in the companies I work with. I see that link very, very closely. I also like the message there around what we're talking about with replacing people with human rights. That's a really nice example of how that culture can be changed, and also an honest recognition there that human rights due diligence and indeed compliance with many of the due diligence laws that are coming will be a continual process. It's not something which is fixed overnight. It's not something that can be addressed quickly. So really useful insights. So Áine, last but not least, let's have a global perspective.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a bit of a different perspective. So for those who don't know the chain is a forced labor benchmark. We evaluate companies across 3 high-risk sectors on how they are addressing forced labor risks within their supply chains. Those sectors are ICT, food and beverage, and apparel and footwear. And our methodology is broadly aligned with UNGPs. So we cover 7 themes, from commitment and governance to the enactment of due diligence, so supply chain transparency, risk assessment, responsible purchasing and recruitment practices, freedom of association, grievance mechanisms, and the 3rd pillar, which is remedy. And our methodology seeks to measure the implementation of policies and the outcomes of those policies for workers rather than just a policy itself. And I think the food and beverage sector is a great example of why the environmental and the social side of ESG need to be brought together. Because for while we know that food and beverage is a leading contributor to climate change and also disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, it is also the sector with the 4th largest prevalence of forced labor by sector globally. And farm workers also bear the brunt of the vulnerabilities exacerbated by climate change. And since January 2022, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre has tracked allegations of corporate abuse of migrant workers, over 700 of them linked to agri-food supply chains. And for this level of risk, we would expect to see a proportionate response from companies in the sector. But we're not, unfortunately. So the sector performs quite poorly on key elements of due diligence. And I'm going to talk about 3. So one of them is that transparency piece. The second is risk assessment with stakeholder engagement. And the 3rd then is access to remedy, which the panelists have all kind of touched upon here. So in terms of the first one, in tracing and transparency, which is an essential first step in terms of risk identification and then addressing those risks. The sector, and also not to mention a requirement for market access under, for example, the US import ban. We see that about 18% of companies within the sector are disclosing names and addresses of first-tier suppliers, which is extremely low. When we talk then about Japanese companies, no Japanese company in the food and beverage sector that we benchmarked disclosed a supplier list with names and addresses. In terms of risk assessment, so these companies are operating and have supply chains across sectors and countries with a high risk of labor rights abuse, climate change, economic turbulence, and also all of them source at least one commodity at high risk of forced labor as defined by the US Department of Labor. So we would expect to see risk assessment being conducted across the board. However, this is not the case. So only 63% of companies within the sector are disclosing a risk assessment. And that falls even further then when we look at whether stakeholders are engaged with as part of that assessment. So only 12% of companies within the sector disclosed engaging with stakeholders. Those include workers, union representatives, local or international NGOs in identifying and addressing those risks. And indeed, worker voice is one of the lowest scoring themes and performing themes across both the food and beverage and the ICT sector benchmarks that we've published this year. And without that stakeholder engagement, due diligence just becomes a tick box exercise, a compliance approach. And finally, then access to remedy. So while we see the vast majority of companies in the sector that have a grievance mechanism that is available in theory to supply chain workers and their legitimate representatives, far fewer of those companies, so about 18%, can demonstrate that those grievance mechanisms are used in practice by workers, which calls into question the legitimacy of those mechanisms. So this poor performance should serve as a call to action for investors. Amidst growing legislation, the proliferation of civil lawsuits, and again, for human rights violations, and that kind of aim to price in the negative externalities of human rights abuse. And just this morning, I read that Cargill had been found guilty of negligence of forced labor in relation to forced labor and child labor within its supply chains. Not to mention, at present, there's 3 current lawsuits going on, Tesco, Intertech and Dyson, for human rights and forced labor within their supply chains in Myanmar. So there is a material risk there. And just finally, regardless of that material risk and that immediate short-term financial consequence, identifying, mitigating and addressing human rights risks within the supply chain is material for all companies across all sectors, and this includes investors. And we've spoken a lot during this conference about systemic risks and fiduciary duty. Well, the risks associated with rising inequality, with climate change, with political instability, these are all risks to human rights. And they pose serious challenges to both the health of the economic system, but also to the financial returns of investors.
Thanks, Áine. Some real food for thought, I think, in the benchmark survey there. I wanted to come back to what you said, though, around the frankly concerning stats on due diligence. Why do you think that, first of all, the response rates are relatively poor or low? And what do you think is driving that?
Yeah, so I guess we see different response rates across different jurisdictions. I guess in the US and Europe, where due diligence legislation is a little bit more pronounced and more vocal, and stakeholders, I think, also are more vocal, like civil society organizations. We see that the response of companies is greater. They're more receptive. Japanese companies also, we see, 70 or 80% in terms of engagement rates with those companies. So providing additional information and wanting to engage with us on the benchmark, that does fall quite low when we look at other jurisdictions in Asia. So Chinese companies, we don't get a lot of engagement with them, and disclosure tends to be quite poor as well. I think legislation, as I said, does have a lot to do with it. Stakeholder expectations and frankly, investor engagement on the topic. I think maybe US and European investors have been a bit more engaged for a number of reasons. And so this has kind of increased the visibility of human rights and the need for companies to address this issue. But yeah, so there are multiple factors, I think, in that.
Okay, thanks, Áine. And just picking up, continuing that theme rather, and Tanimura-san, you gave some great examples of the work that Asahi Group is doing around this issue. Some of the things that Áine mentioned there around the challenges of identifying forced labour in the supply chain, what do you think are the strengths, perhaps, of Asahi's programme in this area?
Okay, thank you, Christian. Yes, so I'm not sure that we have the strength, but we are considering how we should approach to the due diligence, because the human rights incidents could destroy the company at the moment. So we don't. We should be careful to prioritize based on the, for example, if we prioritize based on the value or earning, so small supplier would destroy the human rights. So in the past, we chose the way we chose the very basic way to do the due diligence for 4 years. Then we, as I mentioned, we rebuilt the strategy to cover most of the suppliers or employees. So this order was valuable for us. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Really interesting. And for challenges such as forced labor, in your programs, your due diligence, where are you detecting these issues?
So, yes, especially in the corona pandemic period, we couldn't visit the real site to review the situation. So we could have an interview with the stakeholders, but we couldn't look at the real situation. So for the future, we are allocating our time on our resource to do the real field work to the farm, etc. That's an important point, I think.
Yeah. I think the COVID pandemic put a lot of efforts back on supply chain due diligence, particularly at the ground level. So interesting to hear your experience there. And Kawai-san, I mentioned earlier that in Japan, the guidelines came out last year for due diligence in supply chains. Just thinking about that, are you seeing any changes in Japanese companies' response to your due diligence efforts?
Yes, I think that in the past few years, there are increasing number of Japanese companies set human rights policies and started to conduct human rights due diligence. But there are still some room to improve in terms of, for example, on-site visit, on-site audit of their suppliers, and disclosure of the result of such surveys, etc. So, so disclosure is important. I imagine that it's a little bit dilemma for companies to disclose the bad news. But as an investor, so with a long-term investor, we need to do a dialogue with companies to disclose. So even that, for example, there is a grievance mechanism. Some companies say no grievance report, etc. It looks good, but actually it's not the grievance mechanism is not effective. So we have to support those companies who are doing effort to better disclosure of
I've heard that a lot actually on the grievance mechanisms when asking companies, and they often try to retool their corporate whistleblowing line to use for other rights holders and stakeholders, particularly in the supply chain, and of course that's problematic, doesn't always work. But also hear that response, which is we don't have any grievances, so we must be doing something right, which of course is a red flag for the effectiveness perhaps of the grievance mechanism. So interesting point there, thank you. And then looking from a private market perspective then, Suzanne, what are the trends that you're seeing in terms of due diligence in the supply chain?
So due diligence in terms of the supply chain, I think everything that you've heard today, it's not rocket science, right? Questionnaires, on-site visits, follow-up, grievance mechanisms. The challenge is really doing it well, and also also understanding that there are systematic areas of risk around certain investments, and we've touched repeatedly, of course, on the food, the food sector, agriculture sector related, the mining sector, but really any of those cases where you end up sequestering, communities. Essentially, it's, think what happened with COVID. As people get isolated, we saw bad practices occur. And I think the issue is what we see in the due diligence is either not enough time and attention is being spent on issues that in reality, should be pretty high up there on the materiality threshold, right? And as we've heard, if the report, first of all, if there is a report into the particular circumstance, and that report is saying nothing, do you really take that on face value? So, we all love a good guacamole, no doubt. We all like, having a coffee, a tea. All of those are produced in highly isolated areas. We've seen systematically, within those worker communities, really complicated issues where, often there's a lot of female populations. How do you get a weekend off? How do you ask to change shift? Well, it's not unsurprising that there's extreme forms of sexual harassment that can happen within those worker communities. We need to actually talk about these issues. We need to talk about the complexity of how you change worker, management practices, incentive structures within those chains to actually fundamentally change behavior. Now, I'm talking about the really complex solutions that are needed. There's a whole lot of precursors like asking the questions, doing the due diligence, isolating the issues. And then it's also, I just think, being really realistic about how complex solving some of these issues are. But we know the issues exist, and we need to accept and talk about these issues. As you rightly said, no one wants to say and admit the issues because of the reputational blowback, but in that we all become complicit in their continuation. So just like we do with investment managers, where we encourage them to report on critical incidents and we encourage that reporting as a sign of good monitoring, it's almost like we need to change our behavior and encourage the reporting on these issues.
And you mentioned there about community and community engagement, and that's a relatively nascent topic for private markets. Where do you start? And for many, I guess, in the audience who might be hearing some of these things for the first time around the issues that you're talking about, where do you start in engaging communities?
You go and you find the experts who are good at engaging with communities, and often that might be NGO groups, that might be the trade unions. It's understanding that you need to go to the expert groups and listen and learn. And across private markets, this is the issue. We are building our toolkit around this space. And so we build from learning from each other. We build from learning from what is happening on the corporate side. There's a collective learning, but certainly we know that there are really, really thoughtful groups out there around community engagement, and particularly when you're dealing with, immigrant communities, when you're dealing with Aboriginal communities in different areas, you need to, you need to really listen, and you need to understand what you're listening to. And so, finding those bodies to help with translation, I think is important, yeah.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. So I'd like to open it up to you all now and ask some questions to the panel. Realize we've got, and we're very lucky to have such a packed room this morning. So what I'll do is there'll be a roving mic coming around. We'll take 3 questions and then we'll respond to those in turn. So you show your hand if you have a question for the panel. Lots of hands there, that's great. Let's go to the gentleman there with the bow tie first. Thank you.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. My name is Marius. I'm from Bearings. So the question I have is, how should investors approach companies where human rights abuses are identified? Should companies work with the supplier to improve the practices, or should we expect that suppliers are discontinued immediately, which can have unintended consequences?
Great, thank you. And we had another question there as well. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, Karen Riechenberg for Sands Capital. My question comes from the perspective of investors in listed equity space. At what point do investors stop digging? Because from everything that I've heard and just quite frankly read in general on this topic, it seems that as much as companies might have in place policies, grievance mechanisms, all these good things, they're not necessarily guarantees that everything is fine. And as investors, especially, you're kind of twice removed from the action. In many cases, you don't have the ability to conduct on-site visits, at least not visits that are very real. If you do, then they're going to be very carefully orchestrated and they're going to show you the nice facilities. So, and you can rely to a certain extent on external parties, but there's limits to that as well, depending on geography. So there's sort of a trade-off, I think, in the amount of work and due diligence that you do. And at what point do you say, okay, we have sufficient confidence? Because you're never going to have 100% confidence, right? That there are no issues. So at what point do you say this is enough due diligence?
Great, thank you for that.
Panel also welcomes easy questions.
Okay, let's take one more question over here, and then we'll come over to this side of the room for the next questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Trista from LGM. I think similar to that question, building up on that, also as an index investor, is there a shift from qualitative approach to a scaled up quantitative approach that we may be looking at this topic? Thanks.
Great, thank you. So let's take those in order then. And what I might do is group the last 2 questions together and look for some examples of taking that quantitative approach as well. So the first question was, how should investors approach companies that have got human rights abuses? When do you disengage? When do you engage? Áine, your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just on that, and I'm not an investor, but in line with the UNGPs, like the first port of call would be to engage with the supplier, I mean, depending on what the violation is, and to engage with the supplier to try and resolve that issue. And then if, the supplier is not making progress, or if there's a refusal there that first of all the issue exists, or that to take action on that with sufficient remedy to the victims of the human rights violation, then you would potentially start thinking about a process of responsible disengagement. And responsible disengagement could include, ensuring that the workers in that supplier are adequately, are adequately, paid. If there's any kind of, again, blowback from your exit, then, deciding what that might look like for the factory and its workers, and ensuring that, the human rights, it doesn't cause or contribute to additional human rights violations within that factory. So I think recapping that, the first port of call would be to engage, again, depending on what the violation is, and then seek to exit responsibly if that port of call has not been followed through. Yeah.
Thanks, Áine. Suzanne?
And I think this is sort of a fundamental question, and certainly from my perspective is I definitely endorse the issue of engagement. From a systems perspective, we need to, wherever we can, clearly try and improve improve conditions. The issue is also around leverage that we have at each and individual circumstance. In some cases, investors or the owners, may have more or less leverage to try and get that change. And let's stress the elephant of, the renewable supply chain here. How do you, drive change where there is no alternative supplier? Where there is no restricted supplier. And I think, what we have seen across other spaces with respect to maybe other topics, I think we need to recognize that there is power in consistent and really concerted engagement, but it's only going to work when it happens through the entire stack, when from the end consumer all the way back down. The voice of the asset owner is extremely powerful. The voice of the investment manager becomes extremely powerful, but they all need to really align, and it's not necessarily going to happen overnight.
Thanks, Suzanne. I want to turn to the second questions. I'm combining them. So what point is enough for human rights due diligence, Kawai-san?
Very difficult question. So yeah, even the company who is related and for example, CHRO index, it's a top 5 excellent company. Sometimes happen this human rights problem, etc. So this is an endless, I think effort. But because human rights risks are really hidden risks in many times. So. So important is so the capacity is limited at company side, investor side. So we have to do the most to point out the most risky area, and we have to do our best effort to do diligence, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that also that separation between we know it's people. There's always going to be issues that are happening. But is it part of a systematic pattern? Is it something there that we can address in a systematic way? And by addressing it, it deals with a bunch of issues. We'll never get to zero. But yeah, sorry, just add.
Yeah, just echoing what Suzanne said there. I think human rights due diligence is a continuous process of monitoring and addressing risks. Like every business in this room has positive and negative human rights impacts. And that's just the course of normal business, operations. What you want to be checking as investors, or what we would like to see in general is that the company has a process for managing those risks. So does it have the framework in place to identify, mitigate, and address the risks when they occur? And so that's where we go back to. Do they have a commitment in place? Is that overseen by the board? Do they have the identification measures in place? Can they, map out their supply chains? What's the risk assessment process? Is there stakeholder engagement involved? What's the remedy look like? Is it disclosing the remedy? So it's more, I think, human rights impacts will occur in the normal course of business operations. It's what's the framework that the company has for addressing that and identifying them is what you'd want to see.
And very quickly, how do you make that quantitative? How do you measure that? And you move from that qualitative point to quantitative point, putting you on the spot.
Yeah, it's really difficult because I think, if, and again, as investors who own thousands of companies, how do you scale up that approach to entire portfolios? And that's really difficult. I think prioritization is key. Like Suzanne and Kawai have said, you need to look at the high risk environments, the high risk sectors, and then ensure that you have the level of knowledge. You'll invariably be using the MSCIs and the Sustainalytics of the world, but hopefully you'll also be engaging with unions, on their findings, engaging with the likes of us and other civil society organizations to build in that kind of almost alternative data set, right, of human rights issues within that, and then obviously the controversies and the allegations incorporated on top of that. But it's super difficult. I can't pretend to have the answer there.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Super difficult. Continual improvement. Thank you. Can we take one more question? And I promised this side of the room that we would. So I think there were some questions over here. You had a question? Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Masayuki Nakamura from MUFG Asset Management, and thank you for a great sharing experience. And so I think one of the panelists said that legislation plays an important role to advance human rights due diligence. And I was wondering if a company or investors engage with the governments where your companies or invested companies operate, and if so, I'm keen to understand how you do that.
Thank you very much. So, how do we engage with governments on these issues? Tanimura-san, is this something that Asahi has had to do?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Yeah, so I don't have a specific process for the government, but I believe to do the engagement, the open attitude is very important for the stakeholders. Also, dialogue is very important. So actually, we continuously have the dialogue session with the experts, which is very important and very valuable for us. So I guess the interaction or engagement with the government is the same, should be the same approach for every stakeholder. No special one, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that point around engaging with governments as part of this process?
I think it's been quite interesting, with the modern slavery legislation, that's come out of the UK and out of Australia. So, there's been broad discussion of, obviously, it's not perfect, right? And it hasn't been able to identify in many cases issues. And I'm sure it will go through many a revision. Having said that, what it has done is it's raised awareness substantially by asset owners, by investment managers, on starting to develop systems for isolating particular exposures, right? Be it on a country, be it on a sector. So it's a precursor to a longer discussion. So I know it's not exactly what you were asking, but what we have seen is then feedback from asset owners to the government in terms of the challenges to collect that information from their managers, maybe what the next step should be. So it will be interesting to see how some of that legislation develops.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne. So we have a few minutes left, and I want to do a very quick fire question to each of our panelists in turn. If there was one bit of advice that they could give to the room about human rights due diligence, what would it be? Áine?
I think probably around the reliance on social auditing. I feel like, there's been a lot spoken on this panel about social auditing, and it definitely does have a place in the due diligence process. I would just caveat by saying, interrogate those findings. How, like the methodology of those audit results, are they conducted with, a representative example of workers? Are they conducted on or off site, in the local language? And really kind of seek to interrogate the findings, because it's while it is part of the due diligence process, it can't be the sole arbiter of human rights issues and the identification of human rights issues, which we know they're heavily relied upon, and at worst they can really just rubber stamp human rights violations and risks within the supply chain. So really do interrogate those findings when you see that in company disclosure.
Thanks, Áine. Really important point. Tanimura-san?
Thank you. Yeah, for the human rights due diligence, I think the holistic view is very important. So rather than looking at very small, very one single element, holistic view is very important. Also, we are very keen to have whether sustainable or not in terms of the looking at human rights due diligence. Sustainable platform is very important.
Yeah, thank you. Kawai-san?
Yes. So there is a discussion that it is a systemic problem. So I think that collaboration approach is very important. So the companies in the same sector, or also the investor side, I'm also the part of this PRI Advance collaboration. So investors together, and so also for climate, and not only this company, but also together with supply chain, with also competitors together to improve the system. So investor side, it is our duty to do our best to approach to portfolio companies, including their supply chain. So yeah, and I'd like to continue to collaborate with other.
So collaboration,
yes.
key point. Yeah, thank you. Suzanne?
Yeah, I will just say it differently, because I agree with that point. Currently, the cost of capital for many businesses that involve practices that involve the misconduct, and human rights abuses, is such that it is financial for them to continue to do so. So we have to change the cost of capital of those businesses. We need to make it more expensive for them to be going through all those efforts to do that, those human rights abuses. We need to make the other path far, far more attractive. So I think, the engagement, collective engagement, individual engagement is going to be critical, but we need to drive the change in the cost of capital for those businesses.
Great, really good point. Thank you, Suzanne. So that's an end to our session. I hope you found that interesting and helpful. And as I said at the start, this is a much overlooked area of sustainable finance and sustainability in general, to be honest. It's a challenging area. It's one that will require continual improvement by all stakeholders. But I hope you found those different perspectives of the panel interesting this morning. So final task for me is to say a big thank you to you all for your engagement, and also to the panel for their contributions. Thank you very much.